Hi, Ted Morrissey here, doing a video. It's near the end of our course in the MFA introductory course for Lindenwood University. And I know you've been getting inundated with advice about revision and that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to give you some more. All right. So I do want to kind of pare it down, though, to just two or three, I think, really important lessons to take away from this whole process. Revision is the key to successful writing. And you've been told that since you were a kid. You've been telling others that, especially if you're a teacher, so you know the importance of revision. But the thing is, how do we go about it? How do we get the most out of it? And so on. So that's what I want to kind of deal with in particular, right? And I'm going to focus mainly on revising fiction because that's my that's my home turf, right? That's my wheelhouse, however you want to say it. But I do want to talk to any kind of revision and other forms of expression besides just fiction writing, right? But it's pretty much applicable across the board, by and large, right? So I of course want to turn to this guy. Well, specifically, that guy, William Gass, and Gass wrote a lot about revision and talked a lot about it in interviews and so on, because he definitely believed that revision was absolutely critical. He claimed his first drafts were awful, and that the only reason he was able to achieve anything with his writing was because he just worked and worked and worked. And I don't know that I would agree that his first drafts were awful, but there's definitely evidence of his work ethic. I'm a regular visitor to the Gass papers at Washington University, and there are just thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000. Who knows? I can't even begin to come up with a genuine number of drafts of things. So no matter whether it was a short story or a novel or a novella, which he felt was his natural medium, that's what he kind of worked most comfortably in, that's kind of mid-range narrative, but also essays, book reviews, you name it, you go, and there are just tons of early drafts, just draft after draft after draft, where he's tinkering with wording, rearranging paragraphs, all of those things. And most of that was done via a typewriter. He mainly wrote before the era of the word processor. So going back to the 50s, really going back to the 40s, you can find draft after draft of typed, just a single paragraph in a particular story or article or whatever, or novel, just redone again and again and again in order to try to perfect each sentence, try to perfect the paragraph before moving on to the rest of the piece, which is one of the reasons it took him 26 years to write his magnum opus, the novel The Tunnel, right? He was just a consummate reviser of his work. And this quote, I think, is an important aspect of that I'm about to share with you. This is from an interview that he did with Arthur M. Saltzman, who interviewed Gass several times and wrote about Gass quite a bit. And this is from the fall 1991 issue. That's volume 2, number 3 of the Review of Contemporary Literature, as you can see. All right. And so talking to Gass about artists and writers as artists and so forth. And Gass says, we may be so taken with the result that we forget that another arrangement could have yielded something quite different. And what Gass is getting at here is that if we do invest a lot of time and energy and emotion and so forth into whatever it is, a short story, an essay, a poem, and we work at it and work at it and work at it, and we feel like we've got it to the point where we really are pleased with it, on one hand, that's great. But on the other hand, don't be so sure, or at least don't be unwilling to at least try it again, to rearrange it, to start over, try a different point of view, a different tense, whatever. So don't be too in love with whatever we produce, no matter how happy we are with it. And of course, that's hard when we first have completed something that we're happy with. It's hard to imagine we want to go back in and sort of tear the stuffing out of it and see if we can rearrange it in a different sort of way. But give it a little bit of distance, a little bit of time, that becomes easier. Right now, it's sort of impractical to wait a long time to do that for most of us. But if we can sort of let it cool off a little bit, and then come back to it, we might be more inclined to want to see about making major changes. And again, this is true for fiction writers, it's true for nonfiction writers, it's true for poets, script writers, across the board. If we can give something a little bit of time, we can more easily, I think, emotionally speaking, can come back in and really try to assess it in a realistic kind of way. And as an example of that, I would turn to this guy too, Vladimir Nabokov, who's another of my favorites. And Nabokov is an interesting study because, he started writing in Russian. And so from the late 20s until the late 30s, so a little over a decade, he wrote exclusively in Russian. I think he wrote 9 novels and dozens of short stories, all of which were published and highly regarded by most readers and critics and so forth. But then in the late 30s, he decided that for his career to really get to a point where he wanted it to be, he needed to start writing exclusively in English. He was fluent in Russian and English and French, and he did write and publish some work in French as well. But he decided to start focusing exclusively on writing in English. And I pulled this book from my bookcase, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, because this was the first novel he wrote in English. And it's a great book. It really doesn't get a lot of attention, but it was published, I think, in 1941, something like that. And it's just an incredible novel, and it really ought to be on lots of lists for great novels of the 20th century that people should read. I was kind of blown away by it the first time that I read it, just how good it is, just how well written, and just how, I don't know, everything, right? It's just, very, very profound and thought-provoking and all kinds of things. But this was the first book that he wrote in English, and then there was no turning back after that. Everything else he wrote in English as well. But it's an interesting study because he was, writing and getting published and like I say, winning some kind of accolades, nothing too significant. But his novel Lolita was first published in Paris because no U.S. publisher would touch it with a 10-foot bookmark because of the subject matter. Pedophilia, as a subject matter, was not something a lot of U.S. publishers were eager to put out into the world. But finally, one did. And so Lolita came out in 1954, I believe, and it was just a phenomenal success. It just, literarily, financially, everything you can think of. And so it freed up Nabokov because for the first time in his life, he was, didn't have to worry about money. Up to that point, he taught a lot. He gave, language lessons. He gave lessons in tennis. He was a really good tennis player, and so he did all kinds of things to kind of make ends meet, mainly teaching though. But now, for the first time, he could devote his full attention to his writing. So from the mid-50s until the end of his life, he, wrote prolifically and so forth. But here's the thing. American publishers now were just chomping at the bit to publish Nabokov. Well, he wanted to mainly focus his attention on new stuff. He just had this very prolific imagination. He just had book after book, short story after short story that he wanted to write. But American publishers also wanted to start translating his earlier work into English for financial benefit. Well, luckily for Nabokov, by that point, his one and only son, Dmitri, was grown, and he also was bilingual. And very, very intelligent. So he took over the main duty of translating his father's Russian works, both the novels and the short stories, into English. There were other translators too along the way, but mainly it was Dimitri's, he was the primary translator. And the way it kind of worked apparently was Dimitri would take a manuscript in Russian, he would translate it into English, and then he would kind of run it past his father, who would look at it and kind of tinker with it further, sometimes just the wording and so on. But he also took that opportunity to revise that earlier work. That was very, very common. And not just revise it because when it got translated into English, there were certain things that just didn't quite work in English that worked in Russian. It was like wholesale revision, revising characters, revising plot, so forth and so on. And I bring this up because of that idea of kind of a cooling off period. So here are these published stories and novels, again, many of which were very highly regarded and were considered masterpieces in their own right. But now Nabokov had an opportunity 10, 20, sometimes longer years later to go back to those pieces, and he took the opportunity to revise them. In fact, I don't read Russian, so I can't really judge for myself, but I'm told that this novel, King, Queen, Knave, which is great, by the way, you should also read this book, that it was originally written in Russian. In fact, it was one of his earliest novels, came out in the late 20s, I believe. And when he revised it, or revised Dimitri's translation of it into English, he did a wholesale revision. In fact, those who can read Russian and English say it probably shouldn't even be titled King, Queen, Knave, and shouldn't be, sort of billed as a translation of that Russian novel that Nabokov wrote, because they're so different. They're practically two different books. So again, the point here is that when given the opportunity, even a master storyteller like Nabokov took advantage and rewrote significantly, in fact, to the point in that book in particular, virtually completely rewrote it into a different book, because he just now saw other opportunities, other ways to tell the story, other ways to develop the characters. Not that the original version was flawed. It's just that he now had some different perspectives and different ideas and made it into what he felt was a much better book. We can find all kinds of examples of this. Henry James, the master storyteller of the 19th and early 20th century, was again a prolific author and published all kinds of stories, novels, novellas. Well, in the early part of the 20th century, he worked out a deal with a New York publishing publishing house, to re-release basically all of his work in these anthologized editions. And he took that opportunity to rework, to revise all of that stuff. And some of it, again, is fairly minor in terms of just word choice and maybe taking out a sentence or adding a sentence. But in some cases, those are significant kinds of changes. Another interesting example is James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which, again, is this really complex work that took Joyce 17 years to write. But after it came out, he wanted to get some translations, and others who liked the work, loved Joyce, respected Joyce, however you want to say it, wanted to get the work into other languages. So they worked on a French translation, and Joyce was part of that team that worked on the French translation. But then he also worked on an Italian translation with a couple of other authors. And Joyce fell so in love with the Italian language, and it wasn't new to him then. He was multilingual and taught, all kinds of languages himself. So it wasn't new to him, but he hadn't really been working on Finnegan's Wake in Italian. So when he did, he basically started writing a whole nother book. And in fact, the two co-authors, co-translators that he was working with, they kept trying to reel him back to the original English English language manuscript, to try to stick closer to what he had written in the first place. And Joyce wasn't having it. He was having too much fun writing a whole new book in Italian. So anyway, the point here is that if we give ourselves an opportunity and kind of force ourselves to do it, perhaps, looking at what we consider finished work can actually open up all kinds of possibilities if we're willing to play around, rearrange things, so forth. Obviously, this is true of fiction, it's true of poetry, true of creative nonfiction, true of playwriting, screenwriting, anything, right? If we're willing to, we can make all kinds of changes and revisions and just kind of play with it, just have fun with it, right? Don't treat the original finished version as sacred. See if you can pull the stuffing out of it and make it into something else, right? So I want to one last point here, and this is a revision point, and this is mainly aimed at fiction writers, so poets and nonfiction, creative essayists and so forth. Maybe this doesn't apply to you quite as much, but who knows? You may have ambitions of fiction writing yourself. I noticed in our kind of first rounds of workshopping, and this is very, very common, that a lot of the fiction pieces that were submitted, it was kind of hard to tell, is this supposed to be a short story or is this supposed to be part of a novel, and so on. And I think probably the latter is the answer to that question. It's conceived of as part of a novel or whatever. But oftentimes when we first start writing fiction, the biggest obstacle, the biggest hurdle, the biggest skill that we have to learn is pacing. And oftentimes the stories, the whatever that we write, whatever they are sort of summary of what should be a much bigger work. So we read in just a sentence or two all kinds of things happening. We're given all kinds of character details and all kinds of family history and all kinds of backgrounds about plot and so forth and so on. And really, what is a sentence or two or a paragraph, we should just slow down and we should develop those into much fuller kinds of scenes and so on. So don't tell us in a sentence or two about some character's background, but rather create scenes that help us to learn that via the scenes, not just tell us the information. When you do complete a novel and you're looking for an agent or a publisher, and they ask you to submit material to them, everybody's a little bit different, and so it's a lot of work, quite frankly, to know who wants what exactly. But pretty typically, like when you're approaching an agent, but also a publisher, they'll want some sample chapters usually, or a number of pages. They want 50 pages or 3 sample chapters or whatever it might be. Again, varies quite a bit. They don't want the whole thing usually. They don't want the whole manuscript sent to them just right off the bat. They want some sample chapters, but they do want to have a sense of the whole book. So they'll ask you, again, different places will want different things. Some will want multiple things. And some places ask for a sort of chapter by chapter outline where you say, okay, here are the 25 chapters of the novel, and this is what happens in chapter 1, this is what happens in chapter 2. But instead of that, or sometimes in addition to that, what they want is like a 1, maybe 2-page summary, a synopsis of the whole novel. So they want you to summarize everything that happens from the beginning of the novel to the end of the novel. So they can read a chapter or two that you've submitted to kind of get a sense of your writing style, but to get a sense of the book as a whole and whether it seems marketable and so on, they want to know the whole plot, right? And so oftentimes when we first start writing, what we're basically writing are those summaries, those synopses, that agents and publishers will sometimes ask for. But we aren't thinking of them as summaries or synopses. We're thinking of them as actual pieces of publishable writing, right? But usually what needs to happen is we need to slow down and to develop each of those ideas into fuller scenes and so forth, right? And that's one of the skills that writers of narrative have to learn usually. There are very few people who start writing narrative that immediately have that sense of pacing, that ability to know how to expand and so forth. And so that's something that I think a lot of us need to think about in terms of moving forward with our style, with our skill set, and so forth. All right. Well, I am going to stop there. And I obviously always am happy to have your thoughts on anything I might have talked about here.